It's my absolute pleasure to have Seth Wickersham, senior writer from ESPN, on the Outback Quarterback podcast today. We're very, very lucky to have Seth. He's got a book coming out called The American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. Now, that's available in September. But Seth, it's still months away, that book, and you found yourself in the headlines this week. The Caleb Williams story, which has sort of come out of your book about did he not want to go to Chicago? That is everywhere at the moment. So I wanted to start with, I guess, two questions. What was your intention with the book, and what was it meant to cover, and how did something
hmm
that maybe wasn't the prime subject of the book, being Caleb Williams, turn into this story?
Yeah, that's an astute observation. I mean, I wanted to, I'm a failed high school quarterback. And so I think that even though I've covered the NFL for 25 years, and even though I've written a lot about quarterbacks, I think that I always, I just felt like there was still a more I wanted to understand about it. And it's everything from reads and memorizing a playbook to all the hats you have to wear. You have to be a community spokesperson. You have to be a raging asshole at times. You have to be a philanthropist. Um, and oh, by the way, you also, you wear all these hats, matinee idol. And then, oh, by the way, you also have to be able to throw the ball through slimming windows that, most people can't even see, much less exploit. And so, those are the things I wanted to do. I wanted to understand how quarterback became such a celebrated job in our culture. It's such a strange job, and yet, it's up there with politicians and the highest of movie stars and rock stars. And I wanted to understand that, and I wanted to, I wanted to understand what it builds in you and what it strips away, what it takes to do it at the highest level, and then, for the very, very best who are in the Hall of Fame, what's it like living the rest of your life with this toolkit that you've developed that really is incompatible with life away from football.
Yeah, it makes sense that you mention all of the off-field stuff as well, the expectation that comes with it. And we'll talk about
hmm
Andrew Luck later in the interview, because you did a story on him
Yeah.
a few years ago that was really intriguing, and that whole situation was fascinating. But out of this book, and there's so much to it, and I can't wait to read it in September when it's out. But the Caleb Williams story is all the rage at the moment. You know, you speak, I assume, at some point about the difficulty of the decision um, that faces a guy that's going to go number one. There's not really a decision,
hmm
right? Unless there's some drastic measures taken to avoid a franchise. And that was potentially an option for Caleb. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's not a decision. And, the question that faced Caleb and his dad, Carl Williams, was the same question that faced John and Jack Elway in 1983, and the same question that faced Archie and Eli Manning in 2004. And that's, is the situation with the team that's going to draft you so untenable that you're going to go to drastic measures to try to have some sort of agency over your future employer? And, it really sounds like a basic and reasonable thing. Like,
Sure.
where Caleb Williams, he picked where he wanted to go to college. He wasn't forced to go to USC or Oklahoma before that. But, in the way that we have it in the States in the draft, it's a different process. It's a very popular process also. But it's tough. And, we talk about all the things that go into making a great quarterback, but a lot of it's luck. And a lot of people don't want to admit how much of it is luck. And one of the big pieces of luck is who drafts you,
Mm.
and, what kind of coaching they have and what kind of infrastructure they have. And his once it was pretty obvious that Caleb was probably going to be the first pick in the draft, that was after his first year at USC when he won the Heisman Trophy. His dad spent a lot of time interviewing lawyers, agents, Archie Manning, all these people, trying to figure out if there was a way around the draft. Like, was there a loophole? Was there anything he could do to, again, give his son a choice over where he was really locked in? Because, I mean, there's this funky system that, was obviously collectively bargained in the States, but the way that it works is, if you're the first pick in the draft, that team that picks you owns your rights basically for 8 years if they want to. You get a mandated 4-year contract. It has a fifth-year option if the team wants it. And then you're technically a free agent after that, but you're not really, because they can put what's called the franchise tag on you,
Mm.
which means they can keep you from going anywhere unless they trade you. And they can do that for 3 consecutive years. So you're talking about a sport where the average career spans 3 years, and this team that maybe you have some severe reservations about owns your rights for 8 years. And, that didn't sound very appealing to Carl Williams. He told me that Chicago's the place quarterbacks go to die. And Caleb
It's been
shared
true.
a lot of those concerns. Yeah. And Caleb shared a lot of those concerns. And I think what it came down to basically was, were they willing to do the nuclear option? Were they willing to, blast the city and the team, kind of like how the Elways did in 1983. The Mannings did a much kinder and smoother version of it in 2004. But were they willing to do that to force a trade and make this situation untenable? And the Bears said, we're picking no matter what. And I think the Williamses wondered, like, if they pick us anyway, if he picks Caleb anyway, are we stuck? And we've just created the situation that's even worse. And Caleb, I think he wanted to find ways to believe in his future employer, and he was able to find some of them. But, watching Caleb's first year, all of Carl Williams's fears about the bad coaching and the bad quarterback infrastructure were realized.
Yeah, and that's a great summary of the situation. And unfortunately, in the headline grabbing world that we are at the moment, sometimes that gets reported as Seth Wickersham says Caleb Williams did not want to go to Chicago, right? And they see it as simple as that, when really there's so much nuance to the situation with the care of the father, and then all the implications that they need to work through as father and son and the franchise and all that sort of thing. So how do you deal with it when it comes out and all of your nuanced work gets simplified and blows up into an issue now? Did you expect this, or is this just part and parcel of it, or is this taking you by surprise a bit?
Yeah, so at ESPN, I do a lot of investigative stories about NFL or NFL teams, and I've done a lot of stories that had enough new reporting in them that they ended up kind of becoming news cycles, right? They kind of become news cycles of their own, and so I'm kind of used to it. Like, I kind of understand that once the stuff is out there, it gets aggregated and twisted upon that. And I empathize a lot with athletes who, or anyone really publicly who watches that happen with their words. I was careful with how I reported it, careful with the fact checking process with that, and
Yeah.
it was a nuanced situation. I think that at the end of the day, Caleb Williams got what he wanted, which is to work with an innovative offensive mind and head coach Ben Johnson, who is deeply invested in Caleb's success. But it was a tough rookie year.
And when you get access to guys like Caleb Williams and Bo Nix, who we'll touch on in a second, and Arch Manning, from a journalistic process perspective, how does that work? How, obviously, you've got the might of ESPN behind you, but I'm sure the athletes have to agree, and then you have to agree between you on what you write and what stays private. Very quickly, how does that all come together?
Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, I think that, like, John Elway is one of my main characters in the book. And, John's been in the public eye since he was a teenager. It was one of the things that really drew me to him, was that he was kind of the first child star quarterback in America. He was the first national, star quarterback in this country. And there were regional ones, but not a national one. And, he was the top player in the country coming out of high school, first player picked in the draft, and he ended up being a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I wanted to know, what is that? What does it take to go through that? Because it has to, again, build things in you, and also it takes a lot and it gives a lot. And so, I reach out to John and I explain to him what I want to do. And, this is just for him, for example, but, we meet up, we talk, and there might be some things he'll say, off the record this, but it really wasn't much. And so I think that, like, it's inevitable that someone that you're interviewing and spending a lot of time with and really trying to understand might say something like, hey, this is off the record. And I understand that. And I think that if it's something that fundamentally alters, what I thought was going on, or, fundamentally alters, what it is that I think is the fairest and truest thing that I'm trying to say, then, I might push back on that, or, we'll discuss it. But, that doesn't really happen. I mean, most of these people are grown-ups. I'm sitting there with, recording the conversation, and, when they get anyone who gave a lot of access to the book, I said, I will, I'll fact check things with you. And so it's not, you give them like veto power or they read things ahead of time, but you do go through things and make sure that, what you heard is characterized in a true and within the proper context.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I foreshadowed Bo Nix before, and
Hmm.
Sean Payton. I mean, famously, he didn't get Patrick Mahomes all those years ago.
Yeah,
The Chiefs nabbed him before he was able to. So this,
yeah.
the quest to get Bo Nix, was that an exercising of the demons for Sean Payton? And did he really seek that out to sort of rid himself of that memory of missing out on Mahomes? And what did you get exposed to in discovering that story?
Yeah, I have a really interesting and football insidery, fascinating methodology that Sean Payton used to draft Bo Nix. We can talk about it in September when some of that stuff is more public. But you know, Sean wanted Patrick Mahomes, and he had developed his own kind of analytics method to evaluate college quarterbacks, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And the score that Patrick got out of Texas Tech was really good, and he really liked Patrick. And obviously, so did the Chiefs, and they traded up one pick before Sean Payton's New Orleans Saints and drafted Patrick Mahomes. And I think that, when Sean left the Saints and he spent a year outside of the NFL, I think he really, wanted to come back and find, recreate what he had in New Orleans with Drew Brees, which is, a quarterback that they grow together and, they're on the same page. And so same year that Caleb Williams was drafted, Sean was in the market for a quarterback and he really settled on Bo Nix early. He had to keep it a secret, but he settled on Bo Nix early. And, and then that kind of speaks to what Carl Williams was talking about, which is that like so much matters about who
Mm.
picks you and what kind of coaching you're exposed to. Bo Nix is a very good player. He came to a situation in Denver where he's working with, one of the most innovative offensive minds ever, goes out and has a fantastic, rookie year. And, he was preparing for a playoff game at the same time that Caleb Williams was wondering who was going to be his second NFL head coach and his third play caller. So, circumstance matters a lot. And it's an interesting story with Bo Nix. And it's also unintentionally, it's an informative story about the way that Carl Williams saw the Bears and the fears that he had being realized.
One more name that pops up in discussion of any quarterback these days is Arch Manning. Now, this is a
Yeah.
young kid with a famous name who's started only 2 games in college, and a lot of people are projecting him as the number one pick in the future. What have you learnt about Arch, and how does a kid, I say a kid because he is young, how does someone of that age navigate this pressure in this machine of the American quarterback?
Yeah, so that machine, I mean, that machine's a big thing. And to a certain extent, I mean, my book is about American fame as much as it's about, how to throw a screen pass.
Yeah.
And, with Arch, the moment he decides to be a quarterback, he's surrendering so many things in life. Now he'll gain a lot too, but he's surrendering, privacy for one thing. He's, understanding that, the way that he walks through life, he's going to be judged differently than other quarterbacks and other just people and teenagers. And so I wanted to get inside of that. I wanted to, use it as a way to talk about that family, obviously phenomenal football family in America, and, get inside the recruiting process. He was the highest top player in the country, going from high school to college. And I wanted to get inside the lengths that colleges did to try to get him to go there. So I think it's some pretty entertaining reading.
Can't wait to read that. So the book is American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. A couple of things outside of that book that you've worked on. I foreshadowed it
Hmm.
before. Andrew Luck. Now, there's a
Hmm.
continual story of intrigue. Obviously, retired at the peak of his powers on field in 2019. A few years later, you sat down with him, and really, you were the first person to get the insight as to exactly why he stepped aside and what
Hmm.
his life was like a few years later. Um, Talk us through the enigma that is Andrew Luck and what you were able to learn about him in that rare access.
Yeah, it was, so he retired in August of 2019. And I think I wrote him maybe 3 months later, saying like, hey, I know you're getting all kinds of requests, but keep me in mind. And, I just kind of I'd follow up with him. And, I think that the ideas that I was drawn to discussing with him wasn't really like why he retired, because I wanted to understand the forces that led to that, the things that nobody saw. And I wanted to understand what it was like for him now, because quarterback is so all consuming that it is your identity. Like there's this moment in the book with John Elway where he's just lost his second Super Bowl and he says, I'm not going to have a good feeling about myself until we win one. Like himself, like
Mm.
not like, hey, I'm not going to feel like my career was fulfilled. He took it so deeply personally that he allowed it to define him.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. And so, what's life for Andrew Luck like when you're not a quarterback anymore? But what's that identity like? How do you reinvent yourself? And so those are the things I want to talk to him about. And he was receptive, and we kept in touch for a couple of years, and then he was getting inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2022, and I met with him in like February of that year, and I said, "Look, everyone's going to be coming for you now that you're kind of re-entering the spotlight for a bit. There's an occasion." And I said, "What do you think?" And he was all on board. And I visited him a ton. I visited him a lot in Indianapolis. He ended up at Stanford getting his master's. I visited him there. I took separate trips to visit people close to him.
Mm.
Um, we spent a lot of time together. And, that was one of the most fascinating stories I've done about someone who made such a big decision that he knew was right. And yet, even all these years later, he couldn't exactly articulate. He just kept replaying it. And he just he wasn't able to come to peace with it. And I think that, there's a part of him that's always going to feel that, you know, even though he doesn't regret the decision, that it still just doesn't sit with him right. And it took him a lot of talking professionally with me, with his wife. At one point, his wife told him, she was like, Andrew, does anybody talk about themselves as much as you do? It was a funny moment, but yeah, it was, he was a fascinating guy. He was always a
Yeah.
little different. And I'll never forget, the first question I asked him on the record was, why'd you become a quarterback? And his answer was, I don't think I had a choice. And he kind of said it as a joke, but there was a lot of truth in that because he was so good at it from such a young age in the state of Texas, which is a huge football state. It's like his dad didn't force him into being a quarterback, but his dad was an NFL quarterback too. That like, you know, you're kind of in that American cultural tractor beam right away.
Yeah.
And we value the ability to throw a football so highly, and it's such a rare talent that, once you show you can do it, you do kind of just get, those decisions get spoken for. And I think that, um, throughout Andrew's life, I think he felt like that he didn't have a lot of agency over a lot of his decisions, and retirement was one of those decisions that he could make himself and have full control over.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I guess life is a series of what ifs for everyone, but when you're so amplified
Yeah,
and everyone's watching the decision you make and continually questioning it, it must be a real struggle to deal with. But if
and
anybody
it's
has
interesting.
not, oh, sorry, you go. Yeah.
And it's also interesting because he wished he'd retired earlier. Like that's one of the
Hmm.
regrets he had is he actually wished he'd retired earlier rather than exactly when he did.
Save the body a bit more. Was it just that, or was it other things?
It was a lot of things. It was the dedication that quarterback took.
Yeah.
You just cannot, there's no such thing as a balanced life. I mean, your entire city is counting on you.
Mm.
You have to do everything comes second. Relationships, happiness to a certain degree, everything. And then pain, decision making when you're in pain, how that affects your psyche, your mentality. And, I think that he recovered, that he had initially he hurt his shoulder. It was a mysterious injury and it took a while to recover from, but he did recover from it. And then I think that he wished he'd retired. He won comeback player of the year in the NFL.
Yep.
And I think he wished he had walked away right then. Um, but instead he kept, playing and, training with the team. And he had another kind of weird injury, this ankle and foot injury that came up. Again, there was a lot of mystery around it. Like, what do you do? And he started to revert back to who he was, which is this really selfish, very pragmatic, ruthlessly pragmatic, tunnel vision guy. And he didn't like that guy.
Yep.
And so I think it was all those things.
Fascinating. For anyone who hasn't read that, look it up. Seth Wickersham, Andrew Luck's story on ESPN. It's a great long form read. Take the time to delve into it because it will answer a lot of questions that all of us had about that Andrew Luck situation. There's one more topic I want to touch on before I let you go, Seth, and that is in 2021 you wrote "It's Better to Be Feared," which was a story about a
Hmm.
book about the New England Patriots dynasty. Now, there's obviously been a lot of coverage of that over time, but it continues to fascinate and. We have a debate,
Yeah.
self Hawley and Doss, on this show about Tom Brady. He always comes up inevitably in different forms. And as a personality, he's intriguing because some find him incredibly interesting and nuanced. I personally, on the surface, find him quite a boring guy. Like I think he's a guy that has had a lot of success in his life and is incredible at so many things. Yet I'm not sure there's much that naturally draws me in about his personality. So there's clearly
Hmm.
a mismatch there between how some perceive and others do.
Yeah.
You know him better than most. What is it about Tom Brady that makes him so interesting? And how did Bill and him draw so much success out of their time together?
Well, I think, I think what makes Tom interesting is that, he's so passionate about one thing.
Mm.
And, he grew up a baseball player in a competitive sports family, and, nobody had played football. His sisters played softball. He decided to play football freshman year. He was a backup quarterback on an 0-8 team. He didn't even wasn't even good enough to get on the field. But he said, I took to the game. And I think that that's one of the most important things is that like this was something that he could do without having to think a ton about it. Like when he played baseball, he was never a pitcher, which is interesting. He was a catcher. And he said,
Right.
pitching's too mental. He had to think, pitchers have to think too much. And
Yep.
he liked doing things that he didn't have to think too much about. And I think that even though as he became a better quarterback, he obviously had to think a lot about it. I think that like the purity of throwing a ball was something that delivered, it was not only passion, it was not only something that he was endlessly consumed with getting better at. I just think that like it made him so happy that what revealed itself was that like it made him so much happier than doing almost anything else.
Mm.
And, so he kept playing and he kept playing and he kept playing because, that fire never really went out. And, he paid a price. You know what I mean? Like, he ended up divorced and, he probably could have walked away earlier and maybe his life would have been different right now. But like, you never, those are again, those what ifs you never really know. I think that like he found what he was passionate about. And like, why did he and Belichick work so well together? Well, they're very different people, but they both their lives intersected at the most pivotal moment of their careers because it's the 2000 draft. Brady's not getting drafted. The draft's going by and rounds going by and his name's not called. And he's thinking like, I thought I was going to have a pro football career and I might have to do something else. Then you have Bill Belichick, who had just gotten his second chance as a head coach, went 5-11 his first year with the Patriots. And, he's saying, this is my last best chance to be great at this. And so their lives intersect at that exact time when they were both so focused on being great and so hungry to be great at their respective professions that they provided a kind of answer for each other. And I think that like, what Brady provided for Belichick was stability at the game's most important position. He was someone who was unbelievably curious, eager to learn, willing to be coached, willing to eat shit, which
Yep.
not every quarterback is. And you know what Belichick provided for Brady was a football mind that was just devoted to him improving. Like I think that even though they got on each other's nerves at the end, at the beginning of their career, there was a lot of good times. And Belichick, if there's one thing he's done well in his career, he knows how to identify the weaknesses of a quarterback and exploit them. And he worked with Brady nonstop to fix his weaknesses. And you know that becomes addictive, and that becomes something that like Brady had a personality where he not only wanted to learn, but then he began to assume responsibility for his own weaknesses and fixing them and staying ahead. And, it was really a remarkable partnership. And, at the end, what made them both so great, which is that like they refused to adhere to conventional wisdom that, or what people would tell them or whatever it was. I mean, they just kept believing that you know what they loved doing more than anything was being around football, and that they could keep winning. And obviously, at some point, Belichick thought that Brady was on the downside of his career. He opened the door for him to walk out. Brady did walk out, and he made them all look ridiculous. I mean, if there's one person in this world who should have known better than to underestimate Tom Brady, it was Bill Belichick, and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, extraordinary. Got him again in the end. Unbelievable.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Seth. Very quickly before you do go, what does your
yeah.
upcoming week look like? It's Monday morning here in Adelaide, it's Sunday night where you are in the States. ESPN senior writer, what can you reveal about your week?
Yeah, so tomorrow is a holiday in the States. I'm flying out at night to go report a story, so I'll be gone for half of the week. And then I'm back. And, when you come back from a trip, you're usually transcribing tape or going through notes and trying to assemble things or, you know, do all the things you didn't do when you were traveling. And so, that's kind of what this week's looking like. But the week's changed quite a bit. It's always interesting. There's very little predictability about it, which can be good and bad. But, when you're writing a book, it's very predictable. Like, you got to sit down, you just got to do it. It doesn't matter if it's a nice day, if it's a bad day, if your family's mad at you, or if they
Yep.
are so happy you're around that day, whatever it is, you got to do it. And, when you're traveling and actively reporting stories, it's a little different because, your time isn't your own. You're on the road, you're meeting with people when they can meet. And, then you come home and you're kind of trying to remember what life was like and reintroduce yourself to everyone.
Can you reveal what the story is that you're working on, or is that top secret?
No, 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 you'll find out soon enough.
No, I'll look it up, mate. I can't wait to read it. Look, Seth Wickersham, very lucky to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. The book is American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. It's out in September. I've mentioned all of your other work, or some of your other work, not all of it. Obviously, there's a lot out there that people can look up. They can find you on X, Seth Wickersham. They can find you on Instagram. Make sure you give him a follow for all those listening. Seth, thank you so much, mate. Appreciate your time.
No problem, man. Thank you.